Welcome to the round table of Brandon Woodruff case. We're going to be talking about the facts that surrounded what happened, the arrest and trial and conviction of Brandon, and we're going to try to make some sense of it for the viewers. And we understand that this is probably, if you're watching this video, it's probably maybe the first time that you've heard about the case. So we're going to try to go through it step by step, chronologically, and just kind of present the facts. We'll let you know what happened. We have several different perspectives and points of view. Just to give you an introduction of everybody, my name is Scott Pogansey. I'm the producer, writer, and director of Texas Justice, Brandon Woodruff, the upcoming documentary about the case. To my left, we have Edie Bullock, and she was Brandon's employer at the time and has since become one of his biggest friends and advocates. On the other side of the table, we have Catherine Ferguson. She's the lead trial attorney for Brandon or second chair trial attorney, but kind of turned out to be
Conducted the trial.
conducted the trial, and we'll talk about that you actually came on kind of late in the trial. And we have Becky Wilson. Becky was a co-worker of Dennis at the time that he was murdered, and has gotten to know Brandon and sat through every day of the trial, and has just become one of his biggest supporters as well. And the reason that I have all three of these people is because they lived it. They were there. They know what happened during the trial, and many cases before the trial, and what exactly happened. So we'll go through, and everybody will have their unique perspective to give on the case, and we'll see what information we can get out for you guys. Just to give you a little introduction or setup, again, if you haven't heard of the case, basically Dennis and Norma Woodruff were murdered in their Royce City mobile home in October of 2005. Unfortunately, this was right after they moved from their house in Heath, so they still had belongings or things in both houses. So neither one of them were really kind of moved into completely, and that'll come up a little bit later. But they had lived in this Royce City house for approximately 3 months or so when they moved, and they were brutally murdered in their home. They were both shot and stabbed. Both of them were shot and stabbed at close range, and there were Dennis was shot once in the mouth, and Norma was shot 5 times about the head and shoulders. Dennis was stabbed, I believe, 9 times, 8 or 9 times, and Norma was stabbed fewer than that, 3 or 4 or 5 times, something like that. So when this all happened, the subject of the film and subject of what we're talking about, Brandon Woodruff, was a 19-year-old college student going to Abilene Christian University. He had been there a couple months at that point. He had started in September in his freshman year. And he found out about it kind of the same way everybody else did. Calls from family, calls from concerned friends and neighbors. And he was at college at the time when he found out, and flew back to Texarkana, where his family was from. But let's go a little bit into that. Let's start in the beginning. Edie, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how you found out and what was going on at the time that you were that all of this happened.
Well, basically, Brandon had worked for me at the feed store, and till he went off to college. And after that, I talked to his parents in between times, since he had left, because they came in to buy feed and stuff. Anyway, bottom line is that Brandon called and said that his parents had died in this trailer that they were moving into. And, the only thought that I thought was that it was a gas leak, that they just didn't know anything about it. And next thing I know, they're arresting Brandon for it.
Becky, maybe you could tell us a little bit about when you first heard about it.
Well, I was at work in the middle of an audit, and I got a phone call, and I was asked if I was alone or with the auditor. And I said, I'm with the auditor. Why? And they said, can you get to a conference room? And it was a good friend of Dennis's also, Darren Dodson, who called me. And he said, you know, Dennis is dead. And I'm like, what? and he goes, and we hear Norma too. And we're like, what? And he said, same thing that Edie thought. We all just surmised that it must have been a gas leak or a car accident until we heard that they were at home. Yeah. And so I mean, just in shock, total shock. And then actually learned from the paper about Brandon's arrest, and everyone at work was like, what the? It made no sense. I mean, the kid had just turned, 19 years old, and only a few days had gone by, and they're arresting him, and we're like, what in the? I mean, everybody was perplexed, and it made no sense, because everyone at work knew how close Dennis and Brandon were, and so it just made no sense.
And Catherine, I know that we'll get into the circumstances around how you were first brought into the case, but later on. But I know that when you first came onto the case, that you were really just kind of brought in for one specific reason, and your role kind of evolved into something more. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, when I was first brought into Brandon's case, it was because the sheriff's office had tape recorded all of Brandon Woodruff's calls from the jail, including those to his attorney. Jerry found out about that the DA had them and had listened to them, called me, asked me to assist him with some research. I did assist Jerry, and pro bono came into the case and did all of the litigation on the violation of the Sixth Amendment issues. Once Judge Beacom made his ruling that the state had violated the Sixth Amendment, Mr. Davis asked to have me appointed because that just raised issues throughout the remainder of the case, and he said he needed assistance. So I became second chair counsel for Brandon.
Okay, and we'll go in and we'll go into that a little bit more later. But so. When all of this happened and this horrible crime happened, everybody found out about it. Originally, the investigators, which was Ranger Jeffrey Collins, Joel Gibson with the Sheriff's Department, Terry Jones, some of those names were the ones that were originally investigating this. When they first started kind of investigating this, they talked to a few different people. They had interviews with, a guy named Mike Etherington that gave him some information. His mom, Norma Etherington. They talked with Brandon. They talked with Charla, his sister. So he did a kind of a preliminary investigation, and they basically got it that Brandon was starting to form as their main suspect. Why don't we go?
Only suspect.
Definitely is.
Because I really don't think they looked very closely at anyone but Brandon.
And that's actually, and that's it. It is a little bit difficult, kind of, with the round table, being that the viewers at this point, at least, have not been able to see the film and kind of the background of what was going on. But yeah, I think it's definitely fair to say that they really didn't look at any other suspects, and that's one of the things that people ask me all the time after they see the film or when we're talking about the film is, well, what about these other suspects? Why didn't they look at them? And I think it all comes down to, and we can talk about this a little bit, Ranger Collins talked with the neighbor, Randall Lunds, very early on. I think it was 2 or 3 days into the investigation. And Mr. Lunds told Ranger Collins that, hey, I don't know if this has anything to do with anything, but I'm just letting you know. I saw Brandon at the Heath house the night of the murder, Sunday night. And he was there between 10 and 11 o'clock. That's as far as I can get it narrowed down. And you can actually see in the interrogation with Brandon and Ranger Collins that he tells him, hey, I have a neighbor that saw you there between 10 and 11 p.m. after he gets Brandon to basically commit to the time of leaving at 8 o'clock. So what happens, I guess, or what's your kind of take on that whole like pre-investigator or pre-arrest investigation? As we bring out in the film, 72% of his investigation, 72% of his notes in his investigative report come after Brandon is arrested. So what's kind of your take, I guess, on what happened before? We'll start with you.
It seemed like that from the very beginning, people were going, and they just seemed to have given more information about Brandon and why he would have been the one to have done it. I mean, Norma Etherington calls and says her son, well, she knows something about the murders of Dennis and Norma Woodruff.
And this is at
that should have that was before anybody even knew they had been murdered. So then she comes in and she has her son fill out his statement, and then they interviewed the son, and he basically tells, later on they interview him, they took his statement, but later on they interview him and they find out that a lot of his statement wasn't even true.
And I think it's very important to point out to viewers that call from Norma Etherington actually took place before the investigators even knew that they were both murdered. Because at the time, they didn't know if it was like a murder-suicide, if it was, they didn't know exactly.
Autopsies hadn't been done.
Right. So that's what I'm trying to point out, is that call came in to the sheriff's department from Norma Etherington while investigator Gibson, I believe it was Gibson, and Ranger Collins were at the autopsy. Like, and because he says in his supplemental report, he didn't get the message until after they left the autopsy. He calls and they say, hey, this woman called and she has information about the murders of the Woodruffs, and so they didn't even know. The police didn't even know that they were murdered
hadn't
yet.
been written up at that time, I don't think.
Right, and I think that's important for people to know, Becky.
I think it might be important also to back up a little bit and explain the Royce City House versus the Heath House, because if people aren't familiar with the case, they may not realize that they were actively moving and had just moved, to Royce City from the Heath House, and were having to go back and forth, moving things. They were still in the middle of moving. And a lot of animals were still at the Heath House. And
well, let's just say that Norma was a hoarder. So there was a lot of stuff in the house that they still hadn't moved.
right.
Right. That's true, and there was, and that was kind of the crux of Brandon's story that night. In looking back in hindsight, and what he says is that, I agreed that, it would only take me 30 minutes to let out the animals and let out the bird and feed the dogs and all this stuff, when in actuality, there's no way that I could have done all that in 30 minutes. Like, I had to have stayed at the Heath House for an hour or two. So it just didn't, because he didn't have a watch and he didn't really, Brandon was kind of the type that didn't really pay attention to time. He was a 19-year-old teenager that kind of just did and went wherever Brandon wanted to go.
Well, also he had been strongly advised not to argue with the ranger during that interview by attorneys who were theoretically representing him. And Ranger Collins was the one giving Brandon the timeline, and Brandon was just, oh, okay, yeah, I guess that sounds about right. Brandon, not once did Brandon say, I was at X location at X time. It was Ranger Collins coming up with the timeline, Brandon saying, yeah, okay, that sounds about right. I'm not really sure, but blah, blah, blah. But he had no way to argue to refute what Ranger Collins was saying.
All right, so you feed the dogs and the birds. You were there for like 30 minutes, so you think probably by 8 o'clock then you're headed towards Denton?
Yeah.
Right. And he actually went one further step and told him, I can't give you an exact time.
And then the fence guy never arrived that day.
Okay, and that's at like 7, you think?
Yeah. I just know I can't
Hold
say an
on,
exact
fence
time.
guy.
He did say that, and he told them to check the phone records, which they did not do. That was one of the things that I felt the crime scene was botched from the get-go. The whole idea that they filmed, they didn't turn the lights on in the house to film, and they filmed it all in the dark initially because they wanted the jury to see what they saw. It was just idiotic.
No, not yet. Taking the door that goes into what appears to be the kitchen area, facing east now. No lights on in the residence. Being let in by a flashlight.
They don't know what evidence they could have compromised, but we could, from viewing the video and paying really close attention to it in the dark versus the pictures that were taken with the lights on, we could see that things that had been standing upright in the dark were now knocked over. So they obviously were compromising the crime scene in that manner. Just fundamentals. They didn't fingerprint anything. They didn't fingerprint the light switches. They didn't fingerprint the doorknobs. They did none of that. They didn't immediately get all of Brandon's phone records or anybody else's phone records. They delayed on that. The autopsies were sloppy. One of the things that irritated me about the autopsy is they didn't measure the depth of the wounds. So there was no way to determine if the sword that they ultimately found was actually the blade that caused the wounds, because and then they say, well, a smaller blade can leave a deeper wound because of compression of the skin. That's true, but a short blade can't run someone through.
Right.
And they didn't measure the depth of the wounds.
Well, there's a lot of things I think that about the investigation that were not done correctly, and we can go through.
But I think part of that too was just in general. I think the initial investigation was sloppy, and then once they settled on Brandon as their suspect, they didn't bother to examine or look for. They in effect decided that they had solved the crime, Brandon was the murderer, and therefore they were only going to look at, find, and present that which tended to confirm that Brandon did it. And anything that didn't confirm it or that didn't fit that narrative, they just ignored, jettisoned, whatever.
And I think that's something that's very, very powerful that we do bring out in the film, and viewers will be able to see when it comes out, is the fact that, Ranger Collins is sitting there telling Brandon during his interview, I'm going to check your alibis. I'm going to check your phone records. I'm going to check the toll record. I'm going to check all of this stuff that you're telling me that proves that you're innocent. I'm going to check all of that. And I didn't even realize until I went in and started studying the 100,000 plus documents in this case that and really started looking at Ranger Collins's investigative report, his 320-page report. I didn't even realize that he started writing that arrest warrant as soon as Brandon walked out the door. He had no intention of checking out his phone records. He had no intention of checking out his alibis. He had no intention of checking any of that stuff. Yet he's sitting there lying to him and telling him that he's going to. And then when they ultimately, and we'll talk about the phone records here in a little bit, but when they ultimately do start checking out all of this stuff, they start realizing, oh, wait a second, we talked to the friends, and the friends said, yeah, he went out with them, and, all this stuff. And so really what it comes down to, and what the core of that interview is that Brandon doesn't lie to him about anything about where he went. The only thing is that he's mistaken when he agrees with Ranger Collins about the times that he was at certain places. And that's one of the things I was actually listening to a podcast about the Jodi Arias case on the way in here. And that's one of the things that struck me is that, you know, Jodi Arias originally, she said, I was not in Mr. Alexander's apartment. I was never there. And then all of a sudden, oh, well, they find this camera that has pictures of her there that night. And then she has to go back and recant. Okay, well, actually, I was there, but we got into an argument and it was self-defense and blah, blah, blah. And there's none of that in Brandon's case. Brandon says, I had pizza with my parents. I left. I went to the horse barn. I went over to the Heath house. I went out with my friends. I got done with my friends at the club, and I went back to college.
You have to understand that Brandon was a very respectful kid when it came to adults and things, and you know, he at least as long as he was around me, he was always very respectful, and he was respecting his elders, which his family had gotten a friend, you know, of the families to be this attorney for him, who was actually a civil attorney. He has no experience in criminal cases like that, so he was just trying to do what the guy told him to do.
Right, and that's actually another thing that a lot of people need to understand is that the attorneys that represented Brandon in the beginning, they were family law attorneys. They didn't really have any experience with criminal law. Any criminal lawyer, close your ears, Katie. Any criminal lawyer worth their weight is going to, first thing when they talk to you, is say, don't say anything. Don't talk to anyone. And no, these guys were just like, okay, just keep on talking. And by the way, whatever they say, don't argue with them. Yeah. Agree with them, you know, and
Agree with them.
Yeah.
With the added threat on top of it of, I mean, and it wasn't the ranger saying this, it was the lawyers saying, well, you know, they could arrest you.
I was shocked.
Right here. Yeah. They could have, yeah.
I would advise you not to argue with the officer.
Right.
I think he's already, I think that's the best professional advice I can give you.
Okay.
Is don't engage in an argument with this officer. If there's any question that you don't want to answer, of course you have a right to remain silent, but on the other hand, they have a right to have you arrested and put you, you know, charge you.
I want to bring up something else that it's not usually brought up, is the fact that, you know, Charla had 2 different interviews with the Rangers on camera. I'm sure she had many more off camera, but she had 2 on camera, and the first one was right before Brandon came in. And Charla actually told Ranger Collins, Brandon's going to tell you about this guy named Mike Etherington. And if he doesn't tell you about him, make sure that you remind him to tell you about him. And so it almost, and her first interview again was, I don't really know what's going on. I don't really have a clue. This is kind of all crazy. I don't think Brandon could do it, blah, 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 all this stuff. And she does, you know, kind of not come to his defense, but she does kind of a little bit not point the finger at Brandon.
My brother's going to come in here and tell you there's one kid that keeps causing him havoc. And don't let him forget to tell you about it.
Who's that?
Mike Etherington.
Yeah, I think your aunt mentioned that name too.
All right.
What kind of havoc?
Something about text messages. And apparently since I've been gone, he's been causing a ruckus anyway.
Well, I think that was because it was fairly well known at that time amongst Brandon and his associates that Brandon had had a falling out somewhat with the crowd that he ran with. There had been some strange things happened. Some of Brandon's animals were poisoned.
Yeah, Dennis told several of us at work that he had told the boy to stay away from one kid in particular, and at the time I didn't remember his name, but he was referring to Mike.
Well, it was fairly well documented through actually several different witnesses that Dennis had this opinion of Mike, and it kind of and one of the things that everybody always asks me when we first started doing this film, and even after they watched the screening of the film, is what is the motivation for anyone else? What's the motive for someone else to commit this horrendous crime? And, you know, of course we can't say who did or, you know, who committed the crime because nobody knows. partly because of the investigation that went on, but partly because there's so many kind of factors up in the air that nobody really knows about, that there was some stuff going on behind the scenes that nobody really was privy to because it was just between them. But one of the things that is fairly well documented is that that Dennis did feel that Mike and Norma, his mom Norma, were kind of involved with the mysterious death of a couple of Brandon's animals. And
Well, and I think the motivation there potentially would be the idea that wasn't Brandon winning most of the scholarship money?
Well, he won it all.
He won it
He
all?
won it.
And that other people were not doing as well as Brandon. And there may have been, I mean, that was a theory, that there may have been some jealousy amongst some of the people that Brandon was outperforming in the animal show.
Todd Williams came before the ranger and said, you know, you really need to check into the Etheringtons. And Todd would have known them better than anybody because he was the agriculture extension agent at the time and still is. And he knew who they were and what kind of people.
But then she's interviewed again with Ranger Collins 2 days after Brandon's arrested. He's arrested on a Monday. This was on a Wednesday. That second interview is nothing but pointing the finger at Brandon. And everything that they talk about is just like, well, I didn't know or think that my brother could do this, but now I just don't know. And he's been so all over the place, and he's lies so much, and he this and that. I mean, it was a whole different tone.
Now, we have already done a very extensive interview with you. I mean, I think it lasted 2.5, 3 hours or something.
Yep.
Okay, and I know that we got lots of information from you, okay? But again, you contacted us and said that there was some other stuff that you wanted to tell us that you kind of thought was maybe strange or something.
Yeah.
That your brother was doing, and let me ask you, do you suspect your brother?
Yeah. My mother would never, ever, ever let my brother drive that truck to Abilene.
Are you sure about that?
Positive.
Because we were told by somebody that your parents actually let him drive that truck to Abilene like a month ago or several weeks ago because his Dodge had broken down. And while it was getting fixed,
my mom let, if my brother drove the truck, they must have lied to me.
okay.
All right, so let's get a little bit more into the investigation that went on with Ranger Collins.
I think since the audience is supposed to be people who may not know anything,
Right.
It's probably important to have addressed right up front why they seem to think it was Brandon. And I know we touched on that a little bit, but I think they had jumped to the conclusion that it had to be somebody close to the victims because of the nature of the crime, the brutality of the crime, and the fact that the door was locked, even though it was the kind of door that you can lock on your way out. Those two things, they pinned it down then to, okay, it could only be a handful of people, whoever has a key to this house.
Well, they also tried to claim that the way the bodies were positioned on the couch, that there obviously was not any kind of a struggle or fight, so that meant they must have known their assailants. Never mind the fact that Norma looked like she was trying to hide behind Dennis, and
Had
she
defensive
had that,
wounds.
and had that handful of hair that nobody ever bothered to test.
Right.
And I think some of those questions might have been answered had they bothered to do just the basic minimal, what I would call investigative things like, oh, I don't know, fingerprint the light switches, fingerprint the doorknobs.
Well, a lot of people are going to ask right now, well, how come we didn't do the test of the hairs? And the state didn't do it. They could have let y'all do it, I guess. And I don't really know
My
why.
argument was to the jury that Norma was trying to tell them, Mrs. Woodruff was trying to tell the jury and the investigators who killed her because she had her hair, that person's hair in her hand, and the state ignored it because they had blinders on and they were looking only at Brandon. And long blonde hair didn't fit with Brandon, so we're not going to look at it.
But when we went back and had it tested, the judge only let us have, they only tested one hair. One hair cost his grandmother $2,500 plus $1,000 to match it up to see if it matched with anything. And the one hair that was chosen by the people, you know, that matched it up, anyway, showed to be Norma's hair, or in like of Norma's hair.
Problem is Norma had hair in both of her hands.
Right.
She had, this hand was up next to her head as she was sort of shoved back into the couch, and then this hand is down here. When they removed her hand, post-mortem, hair came out in this hand. If the state of Texas is going to accuse you of capital murder and either seek to kill you or deprive you of your liberty for the remainder of your life, it's not too much to ask to have the state run the tests that are available. And that was not done. And to say, well, why didn't Brandon test them? Maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, but I sit back and I say, wait a minute, whoa, presumption of innocence here. Brandon should not have to do a damn thing. It should be always the burden on the state to show he did it.
I think it's very important to go back and talk about that, you know, Ranger Collins arrested Brandon 6 days after the bodies were found. And that, you know, without checking the phone records, without checking the toll records, without checking the alibis and all of this information. So it seemed like it became a mission to prove that Brandon was guilty, that they had the right guy. How embarrassing would it be to arrest somebody and then find out that you arrested the wrong person? So to that end, and I know we had talked a little bit about part of what was told to Ranger Collins by Todd Williams was that, you know, hey, I mean, this is all after Brandon's arrested, but he basically came to him and said, you might want to look at the Etheringtons. You might want to give them a polygraph because I don't think Brandon had anything to do with this. And I think we'll let Katie tell us what Ranger Collins' reply to that was.
Ranger Collins was not at all receptive to receiving any information that did not align with what he had already decided was the solution to the case, which was that Brandon had done it. Mr. Williams comes in there, he talks to him, and Ranger Collins was proud enough of this, like, yes, he put it not only in his report, but he admitted to it on the witness stand, that he threatened Todd Williams. Said, you know, anybody can come in here and say anything they like. People can say that Brandon turned out the way he did because of your influence on him. Well, with the big shock coming out for everyone, I don't know if it was a shock, but the news that Brandon was gay. And, I mean, here is a family man, a teacher, now being told by a law enforcement official that, you know, well, people could say that you were having a felony-level relationship with a student, not to mention cheating on your wife, not to mention possibly being gay when he's, you know, the small-town ag commissioner, wife and kids, heretofore perfect reputation. No one's ever looked askance at him. I mean, that's shocking.
And that's such a powerful threat that it's carried through today, because he refused to be interviewed for the film. He refused to really talk about the case even off camera. He wants absolutely nothing to do with it, and the words that he said to Ranger Collins when he talked to him about the Etheringtons was the last that Todd's ever talked about this case.
Well, we were told the same thing, that if you were gonna, and by Jerry Spencer Davis, that if we were gonna support Brandon, that we needed to be careful, that our phones might be tapped, we could be followed, and we were like, what? We thought poor Jerry had gone off the deep end, or actually the thought that we had at the time was he had been threatened, because the phone call that I made to Jerry was immediately after the guilty verdict, and I said, what can we do? You know, we were all still in shock, angry, you know, and to get that as a response was, whoa, it was sobering. So I understand why Todd would be afraid. I do.
Well, I think also it is to those who are not involved regularly in the criminal justice system. I think a lot of people have the NCIS or Criminal Minds, black and white cookie cutter. The good guys are always the cops and always the state, and the bad guys are always the defendants and the defendants' lawyers. And it's not always that way. And when you get into it, you start looking and realizing, maybe not from malice, but maybe just from sheer, I think in this case, incompetence or stupidity, things aren't done that you would think should be done as part of an investigative process. Do at least do a complete investigation, but don't do this half-assed Keystone Cops routine and then come in and say, how dare you question what we did? We've got the right guy. Well, really? Then, you know, you've never found the gun. And they say, well, it was the one that was stolen from the lease. You can't say that. No one has ever testified that the firearm that shot Dennis and Norma Woodruff was that cowboy gun. All they could say is that there was lead that could be consistent with.
I don't even know if that gun even worked.
And that's
Nobody could even testify to that.
Nobody could even testify if the Lee's gun. All they could testify really was that the lead was from high caliber, and it could be consistent with cowboy loads. That's all they could say. The knife, all the forensic pathologists could say is, well, it's consistent with, the sword is consistent with those kinds of wounds. But because the forensic pathologists didn't do their job and measure the depth of the wounds, that right there could have eliminated that 1.5 foot long sword if they'd measured the depth of the wounds, because they were saying they were going into the hilt. Well, if that sword went into Dennis or someone to the hilt, the blade would have come out the back end. Right. And yet we had stab wounds that went to the hilt that didn't go all the way through Dennis. How does that happen? It's easy to play Monday morning quarterback on them, but I went and bought this textbook called Spitz and Fisher's Medical Legal Causes of Death. It is sort of the Bible of forensic pathology and investigating. And it says, you measure the depth of the wounds because it tells you, it gives you a range for the length of blade for the suspect weapon. Right. And they didn't do it.
I think that, and we'll, I want to back up to the gun real quick. We'll talk about both of the supposed murder weapons in depth, but the gun, because Dennis and Norma were both shot and stabbed. So the gun, all they could say was that it was a large caliber bullet. It was a large caliber slug and they also came to the conclusion that it was a revolver because there were no casings laying on the ground. So that's kind of what made them lean towards the gun, the cowboy loading Colt 45 that Michelle Lee said was missing from the house. However,
they didn't know when it went missing.
Right, and that's one of the things I want to bring up about this particular murder weapon, because, you know, there's the viewers are going to have all kinds of questions about the gun. Well, how do they know it was that gun? Why do they think it was that gun? But that's kind of why they think it was the gun, because it was a revolver, because there was no casings, and that it was a large caliber, 44, 45 caliber slug that was recovered from the bodies.
That bullet didn't go through, I need to know this, that bullet didn't go and land somewhere, that they have a picture of the bullet. What happened to this bullet?
They do have it. They did have pictures of it. They had an expert look at it.
And all
But he
we
did
could
not
say was,
perform any testing. He said he did an because I got into this round robin with him on cross examination because he said, well, I examined it, and I said, well, you mean you eyeballed it? And he went, no, I examined it. Okay, well, what did you do? Did you measure it? No. Did you do this? No. Did you do that? No. Well, what did you do? I compared them. Okay, you eyeballed it.
right.
I measured. I mean, so I got in this round robin with him. That's all he did. They didn't do any testing of the lead. Didn't do any testing to see if they could find out the composition of the bullet lead to see if it was consistent with certain types of rounds or certain types of bullets. I mean, they did nothing.
So there are several things about this particular gun that kind of show that it might be or could be consistent, but there's also several things that show that it wasn't that gun, and that it or possibly wasn't that gun. And one of the things was that it was basically an antique replica. It wasn't even an actual a gun from that particular manufacturer. It was just a replica of a old, I think like 1920s or something like that style revolver. And Mike Lee, Michelle Lee's husband, did say during one of his interviews with Ranger Collins was that basically he didn't know if it was operational or not. The last time he had shot it was a year or two ago, and it worked at that time, but it had been several years since he had fired the weapon. And then the other thing was, as you guys pointed out earlier, it had been several months since they even saw that revolver, because it was up on a shelf in like a library or some room.
Well, and also, Brandon wasn't the only person with access to the weapon. The Etherington boy had been over to that house roughly the same time frame before the murders that Brandon had, where everyone speculated that Brandon snuck out with the gun somehow. So it's not like this was a gun that only Brandon had access to. There were other people that could have been potential suspects that had access to that weapon.
Joe Hageman and all of those guys were friends with Morgan Lee, and actually had gone on a trip a couple of weeks before that to the mountain. I didn't know. I mean, they were all very good friends, even though Brandon and Morgan dated. Mike and them were friends from high school all the time.
They were a crowd that was running together.
They were definitely a crowd.
And Brandon was starting to sort of separate himself from that crowd and go in his new direction.
Right. And that's a really good point, is that, you know, during this this time, and Ranger Collins even asked Mike about it, and it kind of gets to the point where he asks him, well, what about this this party that you guys went over to? Because there was a party that Morgan had with Mike Etherington and Joe Hageman and Dusty Perry. All these guys were over at the house, and it was only a couple weekends before all of this happened. Mm-hmm. And of course, the prosecution just kind of, you know, glazed over that, didn't really talk about that much, but I think you did bring it up in cross at one point. But that's another thing, you know, that one of the things that made Ranger Collins think this might be Brandon is because he had access to this gun. But he did. In all fairness, he had access to it. It would have been very difficult for him to smuggle it out of the house, because it was a very large gun, and he typically wore very tight clothing, and most of the time didn't wear a shirt and stuff like that. He was just that kind of guy. But it's very important to bring up the fact that there were other people that had access to this gun before or after the last time that the Lees had seen it on the shelf. So, well, the other thing is, it's just like the party incident. The Lees stayed a lot out at their farm in Poetry. They weren't staying at the house all the time anymore. Right. I mean, that was kind of a lifestyle they were going into, and kind of moving some of their stuff out there. Right. All right, so basically there were other people that had access to it. We don't 100% know that it was even that gun, especially considering the ballistics expert that, or we'll call him an expert, that basically just kind of looked at it and said, yeah, it could have come from this gun. You know, and that's a fair point that that Edie brought up, was that they had other bullets, at leftover bullets that, you know, that Mike and Michelle Lee had, that they could have at some point, you know, fired around and then taken the two and, you know, compared them metallically or forensically or however you do that. But of course, that wasn't done. Now, so I think that is there anything else about the gun that we need to cover that wasn't?
Well,
other people had access. It might not have been that
supposed
gun.
disposal of the mystery.
Oh, well,
gun.
the
That
snitch
was-
testimony.
Oh God.
You need to probably talk about that because that was brought up in the Facebook thing.
Yeah, and we definitely should talk about that. So there was this guy named William Pardon, and he said that that Brandon had said to him that, hey, if a gun with a wooden handle is thrown in a lake, will it float? And, you know, at first, it was kind of thought, oh, well, he knows that it was thrown in a lake and, you know, all of this stuff. And, but what had actually happened was, and what most people that look into this, and of course the newspapers are not going to report, but Brandon had access from his attorneys, the report that said that they believed that Brandon threw the gun in the lake. So, you know, if it's like he already has knowledge that the police think that I had a gun, the revolver style wooden handle gun, they think that I threw it in a lake. And it always came up in my mind as I'm, you know, it's like, well, first of all, Brandon denies that he ever said that to this William guy. And there was things going on at the time that, you know, jailhouse politics where the guy was caught trying to steal something out of Brandon's cell and he got mad and there was this blow up and, you know, so there was all kinds of motivation.
He threatened Brandon, as he admitted in his testimony. He said something to the effect of, "I'm going to get you, you little motherfucker."
Yeah. And so the motivation was obviously there to lie. But of course Brandon, you know, denies even saying this. But my initial thought when I first read it in the report was, you know, if I was sitting in jail and there was a gun that they thought that I used that had wooden handles and they thought that I threw it in a lake, or, you know, if somebody, whoever had it, did throw it in a lake, I would only hope that it floats because I want them to find the gun, because I want to prove that it wasn't me.
Well, and depending upon the lake that they're questioning, and they knew Brandon's route, to my knowledge, no one ever bothered to drag the lake and look for the firearm.
Yeah, because I mean, that it kind of shows how much Brandon didn't know about guns, because this was a rather large gun and there was a lot more metal than there was wood.
Oh yeah, there's no way this thing was going to float.
Yeah, so if he did throw it over the bridge, there's only a finite area that it could be, because it's going to go straight to the.
It's not going to get swept away by currents too much.
Right.
Well, it would have been more of Brandon saying, well, if it had a wooden handle, wouldn't it float?
Yeah.
It would be more, I could see more of that happening.
Right.
Than.
Yeah.
Yeah, we drove that route and we
Well,
had
for
to
one
laugh.
thing, you'd have to throw it
You'd
really
have to have
long.
a really good throwing arm, because there's the
Railroad
railway
track.
that goes there. I mean, it wouldn't even land in the lake, more than likely.
Yeah.
It would have
Well,
landed on, you know. On,
And
And Pardon
that's way
had,
far to the
Pardon
lake.
had his own problems with his snitch testimony, because he got a heck of a sweet deal. He was past the point where he would get what was called the 3 strikes enhanced penalty.
Right.
And so he should have been facing 25 to 99 or life, and he got 5 years probation. Probation, I believe, not just. Yeah, and I think it was straight. I don't even think it was a deferred. I think it was a straight 5-year probation for someone who's facing 25 to 99 or life. That was a little weird.
And sitting through the trial, I remember thinking, man, the prosecution has to be desperate to be using a jailhouse snitch. That, you know.
All right, so so I think we covered the gun. Let's move on to the knife, and we talked about some of the elements of this sword. But let's start off with the basics of it, which is how it was found. So 2.5 years after Brandon's arrested, Brandon's Aunt Kathy is going through the Heath house barn and supposedly getting the house ready to sell or whatever. And lo and behold, runs across a box that has some knives in it, and here's this medieval looking sword, this 18-inch sword. And her immediate thought
Wrapped in plastic.
It was all wrapped up.
wrapped in plastic under a bunch of boxes,
With some other knives.
as well. Yeah, there was another knife that was seized and tested, and there was nothing on that. But still, we're 2.5 years later, right? And in that 2.5 years, and this is something that most people don't know, but that we need to bring up, is in that 2.5 years, the contents of the house and the contents of the barn had been moved back and forth a couple different times. There was a leak in the house, and everything had to be taken out so they could redo all the flooring and redo all that. And then everything was gone through. I heard a story, and you can tell me if this was true, that the eQuest people came and volunteered to go through all of this stuff, because Dennis and Norma were hoarders, basically. And you can look at the pictures of the Heath house, and you can see that there was a lot of stuff, and there was a lot of stuff in the barn.
Well, but the other thing most important I think everyone needs to understand is the barn was never secured and was never searched. So to just assume, well, that sword must have been in there all along, you can't do that, because again, it's law enforcement's burden. Law enforcement couldn't be bothered to search it.
That the people from eQuest sent over, I think it was like 15 or 20 like volunteers, and they all came over and they went through everything, and okay, well, to me this is junk, so we're going to put it in one pile. To me this is something the family might want to keep, so we put it in another pile. So it was gone through, and that's what I think a lot of people don't understand, is that when all of this, when this barn was released back to the family, and in between that 2.5 years, it had been gone through several times.
And all the while, Brandon was in jail.
And
So he
Brandon's in
certainly
jail.
didn't have access to the barn to be wrapping something up in plastic. And as far as I know, I've never heard that anything was checked for fingerprints, or if it was, they never found his fingerprints because they didn't have his DNA on it.
All they found was this had a rather ornate handle. And they found up in the handle, up under some of the ornate scroll work, I think it was, they found a trace of blood, which turned out to be Dennis Woodruff's. They did not find any of Norma's blood on it. They did not find a mixture of Dennis and Norma. They found up by the handle, where you would expect if somebody was fiddling with a knife and cut themselves and then grabbed the knife and moved it, that it might get blood on it. But there were no stains, luminol, whatever you want to call it, showing up even on the blade, to show that there had been blood recently on the blade.
Right, and I think there's a couple of different important points about that, and I didn't actually even realize this until I was reviewing the crime scene video. You know, their theory is that Brandon used this sword in this horrific, bloody crime scene, and then somehow cleaned it up. He either washed it, or he wiped it down, or somehow cleaned it up, except he missed a couple drops of blood, right? So that's their theory. If you look at the crime scene video of when they're a real close-up of the sword, they go all the way down it, that thing is dirty. Mm-hmm. There's mud marks on it. There's dust. It's a dirty knife. This is not something that had been cleaned, wiped down, wrapped in plastic, and sat in a box for 2.5 years.
Again, it was a situation of, well, this doesn't really match with the evidence we've been told, but it will help fit our theory that Brandon did it, so we'll cram it in there and claim it's the weapon. And the fact that there's one little tiny bit of blood from Dennis on the handle from an incredibly bloody crime scene where a knife was used, the same knife was used on both Dennis and Norma, well, it must be the knife.
And none of Brandon's DNA.
Yeah, nothing from Brandon on it, but Dennis's is on it.
And I think that's a very important point, and I'll give the analogy or kind of the visual this way. If I was to take a drop of water out of that water bottle, and I was to take a drop of tea out of that cup right there, and I was to mix the two, so now you have two liquids mixed together. There is no way to separate those two drops of liquid, okay? So if this was used in this murder and it killed both Dennis and Norma, there's absolutely no way that there would be only one person's blood found.
Why is that just straight Dennis's blood? And the most logical explanation is because Dennis had a paper cut or cut his hand or something at one point when he picked up that knife. That's the more logical explanation than there was some convergence of all these bizarre events, including, the complete suspending of the laws of physics or whatever on that knife, and only Dennis Woodruff's blood stayed on it.
Right. It's impossible. There's no way. And that, to me, that should have been enough for the jury to say, okay, that wasn't the knife.
And they want you to believe that a double-edged blade left single-edged knife wounds too.
Right. And that's something that, while we're talking about the knife, that's something that I think is very important for people to understand is, and while we're talking about this, I'll be able to take the actual photographs and put them up so they can see them. But there are pictures of wounds that show that that you have kind of a dull edge here, and then it goes down into a sharp edge, which is what would be consistent with a kitchen knife. If a kitchen knife has, exactly.
You have a straight triangle that's a single-edged blade, and then the kind of oval shape is the double-edged blade.
Right. So you're going to have, if you had a double edge, then basically would show
this
that.
one.
Yeah, there would.
You're not going to have a blunt end here on a double-edged blade.
Right, and that would be consistent with a kitchen knife, which is if you think about
any single-edged blade.
Or any single-edged blade, right? So that's important, I think, for people to understand, because if that's the case, if there are wounds that show this single edge, then now we're up to at least having two knives, two swords, two knives, whatever, plus a gun. So now we're saying that not only did Brandon by himself use two weapons, but now we're saying he used three weapons. I mean, it's get ridiculous.
Well, not only that, but given that this was a bloody crime scene, given that you would anticipate the perp to have had blood on their hands, Brandon, what we were able to reconstruct of Brandon's phone calls that night from his cell phone records, plus Morgan Lee, Alex and Robert looking at their phone messages and comparing them and compiling them to figure everything out. How on earth did Brandon commit these bloody murders in, number one, such a short period of time, but number two, there's no blood on his phone.
Right.
Or his clothes, or his truck.
They initially claimed he had the bloody knife and the bloody clothes in the bag in the truck when whoever, Alex or somebody, tried to open it, and Brandon freaked out and said, "Don't open that bag, don't open that bag." But then, of course, when they tested that bag, there was no blood on the inside of it, so that theory goes out the window. But Brandon was using his phone during times that you would have reasonably anticipated the murder to have just immediately happened or very quickly thereafter, and the quote-unquote cleanup or whatever was going on. How did he not get any blood on his cell phone? How was there no blood, no trace in the car that he drove from his parents' residence to the Heath house. There was no trace evidence found in the Heath house. Nothing.
And you brought up the bag, and I want to go over that real quick, because there is questions from people online that about the bag, because there was testimony that Brandon started to kind of freak out when they started looking through the bag. So this is the people that are in the car at this point is Brandon, Robert, and Alex, right? They're all in the car, and they're just kind of like driving to the club, and they're just kind of teenagers having fun. And at one point, Alex starts to go through Brandon's bag that he had brought from college and stuff. And he starts opening it, and he's going through it and all of that, and starts, kind of taking stuff out. And I mean, he had like underwear and stuff in there, just kind of goofing around. And Brandon kind of starts to freak out and says, "Hey, don't go through my bag. Don't, that's private, whatever.
That's my stuff."
And that's my stuff. And he gets from all accounts pretty adamant about it. Like, he pulls over the truck and is like, "Hey, I said don't go through my bag." So one of the things that the prosecution brought up is, oh, well, that shows that he had stuff in the bag that he didn't want him to see. Their theory, of course, was that it was the bloody clothes and the sword or whatever. Well, Brandon's testimony, or not testimony, but his account of it was basically that he had some gay pornography in there, and had some things that he didn't want to be found because
Well, he didn't want Robert to see it.
Right, because Robert
knew he
was there.
gay,
Well,
and Robert was straight.
yeah, and ACU was very no on alternative lifestyles. So obviously it would stand to reason that Brandon wouldn't
Yeah,
want.
he didn't want any of that.
Right, and that's what I wanted to bring out, is that, Robert, if he had confirmed, because there was, everybody that knew Brandon kind of suspected that he might be gay, but if Robert was to go to the board of the college and say, "Look, I saw in his bag that he had gay pornography," Brandon would be kicked out of school. So this was a very serious matter.
He was
and
already on a thin line.
Yeah, it was already kind of getting towards
Yeah.
probation and all of that, failing some classes.
And there's a difference between going and dancing at a club that may or may not be a gay club versus having pornography.
Right.
I mean,
Well, even Robert was going to be at the club, so
Right.
it wasn't that big a deal that they were going to this club because they were dancing with girls. They were
I
dancing
think it was.
with guys.
I think it was kind of. It may have
was a
been
mix thing.
predominantly gay themed, but I believe it was a mix because, again, there were lots of women there dancing.
Right, and this particular club had the reputation around Dallas of having the best dance floor in Dallas. So there was a lot of people, straight, gay, whatever, that went to this club. So
Right.
that's one of the reasons I think that Brandon felt comfortable taking Robert to this club.
I just know that Brandon said I didn't want him finding that I had gay porn in the bag. I didn't want anybody finding it.
Well, unfortunately, though, in the sitting through the trial, that was one point where I was thinking it would be helpful if they weren't able to plant this idea in the jury's mind that there was something nefarious in the bag. No one just came on the stand and refuted that outright and said either they saw what was in the bag. The best we had, which I thought was pretty good, was the fact that they didn't find anything on the bag. There was no trace of blood on the bag. That was
And they
one of
tested
the.
it more than once.
Yes, they tested
Multiple
it.
times, and they still couldn't find anything on it.
Yeah, but if you wanted to believe the sword was already wrapped up in plastic at that point in the bag, obviously the jury did something to come to their conclusion. And they were grasping at straws because at the time I thought, what a miscarriage of justice.
I want to talk a little bit about the arrest warrant. Ranger Collins starts preparing the arrest warrant as soon as Brandon leaves the Hunt County Sheriff's Office. The stuff that Ranger Collins put in the arrest warrant. Friday, was the day that Mike Etherington told Ranger Collins that Brandon put in his MySpace that I hate my fucking parents and I wish they were fucking dead, right? In the meantime, before the arrest affidavit is drafted, Ranger Collins checks the MySpace page and he sees that that's not what it says. Now, he does put in the arrest affidavit that this is not, that, you know, Mike Etherington said he hated his parents and Brandon hated his parents and wished they were dead. But we checked the MySpace and that's not what it says. So he does actually come back and kind of say that. But the question is, if you checked it out and you saw that it wasn't true, why are you even putting it in the arrest affidavit?
I'll play devil's advocate here, just because I'm used to dealing with law enforcement on this kind of stuff. And it could be that, because Mike Etherington, what he may have seen one day, I could put something on my Facebook, and unless you do a screen capture, I could say it one day, then go back and delete the post. Mm-hmm. And so then you come back and look at my records, and it's not on there.
Right.
Well,
but
and that it says that in here. It says that Etherington called and advised that the entry about Brandon Woodruff's parents had been recently changed from what Mike had told the investigators was currently on the survey. It wasn't until he actually interviewed Mike and found out that Mike never saw
Mike
that.
never saw it.
He
Right.
never saw it in the first
But
place.
I guess my question goes back to the
So why
more.
would you put something in an affidavit
Yeah.
like that that you never witnessed, and you don't even have proof that that guy even witnessed it?
Again, you're looking at, you're not having to prove in an arrest warrant, you're not having to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. You are merely alleging sufficient facts to grant probable cause, meaning is it more likely than not, that he did it. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm playing devil's advocate just because I do this kind of stuff for a living. So an arrest warrant a search warrant, an arrest warrant, you can have it based on hearsay that other people told us. The officers don't have to necessarily have witnessed it. What I'm saying is the standards for what will get you an arrest warrant or what will get you a search warrant are not the same as what you're having to deal with if you were to then turn around and try to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. It's a different standard. It's a much lower burden. So he is going off of, he's basically compiling what he believes are his best snippets and putting them into one document to say to the court, I think this is why I think this guy is a suspect and should be arrested.
Well, I mean, and you could almost go through every page of this affidavit and at least one thing on the page is wrong or not legit.
I understand, and again, I'm not defending Ranger Collins. I'm playing devil's advocate just because there is a different standard.
Well, let's just go over the things that were in the arrest affidavit. The first thing was that Mike had said that Brandon killed a mother cat and threw her over the bridge.
Well, the first thing that I noticed was that there was no forced entry, and all the doors and windows in the residence were locked. The scene indicated that there was no struggle whatsoever, and that the suspect was in extremely close proximity to the victims at the time of the victim's death. Well, there was a struggle because you would have had the defense wound on Norma's hand. And second of all, the deal about the doors and windows not being locked, I mean, if in fact it was someone, we all are of agreement they knew whoever it was that killed them, obviously. And if it was in fact somebody that they knew, then they let them in. And it wasn't a struggle at the time. It wasn't like somebody barged in. It was that they came to the house for a reason to discuss something or whatever. And when and if after they killed them, then they obviously locked the door. So that really doesn't really matter about any of that. It says in this thing that there was blood that was discovered in the bathroom sink, shower, and floor in the bathroom.
He made the assumption of blood because the luminol reacted and fluoresced. But What is something that makes luminol fluoresce? Bleach.
Right.
So what do a lot of people use in their bathroom cleaners, and what were some of the bathroom cleaners in the house? Comet with bleach.
So basically, yeah, he was just making that. But let's just go through all the things that they alleged. That there was the incidents with the cat. There was the MySpace incident that Mike had told him a couple days before. There was Charla saying that Brandon inherited his dad's temper. There was Michelle stating that there was this gun that was missing that Brandon had access to.
There was a whip.
What else? Yeah, I think Charla alleged that Brandon had at some point, horsewhipped her, and when they were kids that he used to beat her or something like that. That's pretty
Well, it
much.
does say that Brandon had claimed there was no strained relationship, and Charla said there was a strained relationship with the parent.
I guess the question is, if all of these things, even if they are true, what points to the fact that he killed his parents? There's no actual evidence. There's no physical evidence. There's no DNA. There's no fingerprints. There's no actual evidence. The only evidence that's in there is that Brandon's a bad dude, right? Brandon's a bad kid. He's a bad seed. But I guess where I'm getting with this is I'm trying to figure out what makes Ranger Collins think that because he may have hurt animals and he may have put on his MySpace that he hated his parents and he may have done this. What makes him think that he was actually at the crime scene and killed his parents? Like there's no direct evidence. There's no evidence at all that shows that he was there and that he was the one that committed the crime. I guess that's kind of the magic question.
The direct evidence that Brandon was there at some point in the evening is Brandon's own statement, which they tracked and verified with the receipt from the Milano's Pizza and finding the uneaten pizza still in the refrigerator. So I think they were going off of Brandon had been there at some point that evening. And then Ranger Collins sort of confuses Brandon about the timeline and starts assuming that the timelines he's giving Brandon are timelines that Brandon has affirmatively endorsed, which he hasn't, and then say, well, okay, you were there and your timeline's jacked up and your sister says you've got Mama's truck and Mama never let you have it and you've got one of your parents' credit cards. You must have done it.
Right.
Yeah, since when does being in your own house, eating dinner with your own parents, make you a murderer?
Well, it's not that he was there. It's that he was there, and then I think two things that sealed it for Ranger Collins are, number one, he thought Brandon lied to him about the timeline, which anybody who actually objectively went back through the evidence and look at it would say, no, he didn't lie to Ranger Collins about the timeline.
He was being accommodating to Ranger Collins.
Right. But secondly, the big red flag is what he told several people was that, well, if Brandon can lead this double life and lie and make people think he's not gay when he is, well, then what else can he lie about and fool people about? And I think that's the big thing for Ranger Collins was he thinks Brandon's lying to him about the timeline, but then he's looking at this kid that has a girlfriend and yet he's being told over here is gay.
And what does Ranger Collins know about the coming out process?
Well, I would think it'd be safe to say that those of us who are not gay have no clue what the coming out process is like. I certainly couldn't tell you what it was like. I mean, but a big burly,
Right.
Bubba type, he's not going to have a lot of sympathy for that type of a person.
Right.
Anyway in his mind, and he has already put two and two together to say, well, Brandon was misleading his family or other people, even though if you really bothered to investigate, it was one of these things of, well, we had suspicions, we just never directly asked him. It wasn't like Brandon was, Sam Elliott the movie star, and then suddenly Sam Elliott says, "Oh, I'm gay." You know, everybody goes, "What?" The point is, you had Ranger Collins had a kid that he was, on basis of some information he was getting, he was not inclined to be overly sympathetic with in the first place. I'm just saying that I think from Ranger Collins's perspective that he thinks he's got Brandon in a lie on the timeline.
Right.
And
He's got Brandon in his mama's truck, and he's got Brandon with a credit card. So that is going to naturally make him prime suspect. Now, personally, I think he was premature in arresting Brandon, because he should have, before he arrested Brandon, done what he said he was going to do. And it's always, this is me purely speculating, but I would say it's always a feather in the cap of law enforcement to be able to quickly solve an offense, as opposed to like what's going on in Hunt County right now with Michael Chambers, where everybody's going, "Where's Michael Chambers?" Or there's a couple other murders in Hunt County that are unsolved that everybody's up in arms about, but so it doesn't look good for law enforcement to have unsolved crimes floating around. So
Especially one so vicious.
right.
Yeah.
So it's, hey, look at us. We solved it. Community can rest easy. There's not some crazed loon that's going to strike in another 2 weeks and kill a bunch of people in another house.
I think it's very important to note that Ranger Collins has denied any request for an interview that I've given him for the film, along with anyone on the prosecution side, from the assistant district attorneys to the special state prosecutors to the judge to the sheriff's deputies. Nobody involved in the prosecution of Brandon Woodruff will return my calls.
Well, and the other reason too is, and it could be not because of any of that, but it's just that Ranger Collins doesn't want to have to answer for making statements like with what he did, the threat he gave to Todd Williams,
Yeah.
or his comments in his police reports, or to half a dozen other people of, well, if he's capable of covering up his sexual identity, he's capable of murder. I mean, those are kind of hard to defend, and he just may not want to have to answer to those on camera.
Right, and it's funny because when I first made all of these requests, when I was first starting to work on the film, the Texas Rangers were the only organization that actually even responded to me, and it was the head of media affairs, or whatever his title is, but a guy named Tom, very nice guy, but he said in the beginning it was, hey, we have all kinds of time restraints and we can't do it, blah, 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 on camera. But if you give me a list of questions, I'll be more than happy to forward them along to Ranger Collins, and we'll see if we can get you some responses, whatever. I said, okay, no problem, I appreciate it. And I sent him, I think, 8 pages of of questions. And
Just a few.
Just a few. And
See if he'd answer one.
I was hoping he would answer at least one of them, but that was the last time I talked to him. So.
Have you followed up to see?
Oh yeah, I've talked to Tom several times, and they eventually did give me a generic statement from the Rangers organization, the Department of Public Safety, that basically just said, our job is to collect the information, pass it along to the prosecutors, and then their job is to, just the very generic that basically we did our jobs and that's it. So that's why I said nobody's granted an interview. And I want to get into just a little bit about, I know we talked a little bit about the timeline, but one of the things that we point out in the film is that Ralph Guerrero and Adrian McFarland, they present to the jury that Brandon is unaccounted for an hour, right? And it even says in there, it says from 9:30 to 10:30 he's unaccounted for. Yet Ralph Guerrero turns right around and says, well, Brandon gets a phone call at 9:41 from his girlfriend. They talk for three and a half minutes. Well, wait a second. If he's unaccounted for from 9:30 to 10:30, but you just turned around and said he got a phone call. So it was very obvious that the prosecution was trying to portray to the jury that Brandon had an hour, that he was unaccounted for, could have killed him any time in this hour, blah, blah, blah.
Similar to the magical sword that just
yeah,
kept
the
growing.
Well,
the
and-
amount
and-
of time kept growing.
And they settled on 9:30 because that was when Bonnie got off the phone with...
No, the other grandmother.
Oh, the other grandmother had finished her call with Norma was sometime around 9:30, so that's how they got the magic hour of 9:30 to 10:30.
Right. And one of the things that we do is we go back in the film is we actually show that, taking into account drive time, taking into account phone calls, taking into account all this other stuff, that there was literally 14 minutes that Brandon was quote unquote unaccounted for. And this is all forensically gathered information. Like, this is toll records, this is phone records, this is, drive times that were given to us by the police. So these are all, this 14 minutes is the best case scenario for the prosecution, that he had 14 minutes to commit all of these different crimes, or all these different acts in the crime.
Yeah, he had to be able to shoot his father and mother, stab them multiple times, clean up the crime scene, get into his mother's truck, then leave, drive his truck to get to Heath, to be at the Heath house, to do everything in timely at the Heath house.
And at the Heath house, he would have had to, they allege he would have had to have taken this sword, cleaned it up so well that there was only a couple drops of blood.
Wrap it in plastic.
Put it in a box, put it underneath a dozen or so other boxes.
Well, let's even put it this way. I remember, and I'll never forget, if you're talking about a huge gun and you're talking about this magical huge sword, he walks into his house, and I remember them saying, oh, he was in the house sitting there watching TV with them.
He got up, well, he had it allegedly somewhere in the house, and he supposedly got up from the living room. I mean, maybe it was part of what was in the magic bag that they were that he was supposedly so worried about. I don't know. But it just, the time frame still didn't work. And there were other things about the crime scene that were unaccounted for that nobody to this day has been able to explain to me why the Rangers chose not to take pictures and not document visually with photographs or video the condoms strewn on the floor, but they put it in their report. What was that all about?
Right. Well, I mean, there
And
were...
why would Brandon go throw those, or what were they doing there? I mean, it didn't even make any sense.
Well, I think that can just be chalked up to incompetence, because I don't think at the point that they were taking photographs of the crime scene that they had their theory developed yet. So it was just kind of just incompetent, like they just forgot, or they just didn't.
I think it is general incompetence, because remember, this is the crew that decides that it's really important to burn up all the battery time on the video, filming something in the dark where nobody can see anything, because we want the jury to see what we saw. What? Nothing? Sometimes I suspect that officers at scene make executive decisions about some evidence that they will and will not inventory. And I think that may have happened here out of a desire not to embarrass the family of the deceased or besmirch the name of the deceased. The problem is that in this circumstance, we don't know if that was relevant to who did it or not. And we're never going to know, because they made an executive decision not to photograph it, not to record. In the same way, we're never going to know if Brandon's were the only fingerprints left on the light switches, or were there somebody else's. We're never going to know that, because they made the executive decision at the time when they had exclusive control of a crime scene. They made an executive decision not to take certain actions that, to be perfectly honest, it's incompetent for them to not do it. And that's why Brandon is stuck in the position of having to argue now and have these people say, prove your innocence. No.
The less they have, the less they have to work on.
The less they have, the less the defense has to throw rocks at, too. But it goes both ways, because then it turns on the less they have, the defense, as we did, stand up and say they got a bunch of nothing. This is all smoke and mirrors. I think I used the example of the big green floating head in The Wizard of Oz. It's an illusion. It's not real. It's an illusion. When you look closely at it, you see he not only could not have done it, he didn't do it.
And again with the timeline though, getting back to the timeline, it's to me, and we'll leave this up to the viewers to make their own decision, but to me, 14 minutes to do all of those things is just, I don't know that an assassin, a paid assassin that's experienced could do so.
It would take 14 minutes for him to do all of that, and then he had to have the best possible traffic conditions to get from Rockwall. This assumes that everything all the laws of physics were suspended for a moment, or that there was no delay on the highway. There was no that Brandon had to drive this speed and this speed only.
And the conditions, a lot of people don't understand also, is the conditions on that road where they lived, that Lawrence Drive, are different now than they were back then. Back then, that was a little two-lane country road. Now it's like a built-up 4-lane concrete paved road. So
that would be easy to imagine somebody hauling 75 down, as opposed to a white rock. There's a difference in how fast you can go down certain roads.
Right. Well, and that was actually a school right in front of a school.
Yeah, but again, it comes down to the biggest thing is that not only is it 14 minutes and you can make up your own decision whether or not 14 minutes is enough to do all of these things, but the important part is that the prosecution laid it out as if it was an hour. And every single juror that I talked to, when I told them, hey, it's really 14 minutes instead of this, 30 minutes to an hour that the prosecution tried to portray it as, every single one of them told me they would have said not guilty. And that's what I try to show in the film, is that if you exclude all of this, then there's 14 minutes where there's no phone calls, where there's no basically he's quote unquote unaccounted for. And again, that goes back to what we're about to talk about now, which is the phone records that, Brandon tells Ranger Collins in his interview, if you'll just go look at the phone records, you will see that I was not at that house at the time that you think my parents were killed.
I just want y'all to check out things.
Okay. We are going to check out.
That's what I'm saying. I don't know how they can say that I was there if...
So you're telling us straight up...
I'm telling you 100%.
You did not kill your parents.
No. That's fucking crazy. Excuse my language.
And, and that's when it seems to me, if I was a competent investigator, that if I've got somebody sitting in a chair, in the interrogation chair, and he's telling me that there's a piece of evidence that's going to prove beyond any doubt that he was not the person that did this, my first inkling would be to go out and get that evidence and take a look at it to either prove that he's lying to me or to prove that he's correct and I really got the wrong person. So when we look at the phone records, Brandon's waiting for these phone records to come back because he knows as soon as they come back, they're going to prove that he was innocent, that he was not at the Roy City house, blah, blah, blah. And lo and behold, what happens when we get the phone records? There's 14 hours missing, including the time that he supposedly was at the Heath house. So that's, obviously that was a letdown to the defense.
Well, and that's something that also I think the people watching the roundtable need to understand. That is not anything that can be recovered or recreated. Right. If you don't get those records within a set time frame from the telephone provider, they're gone.
Right. And that, yeah, because I'm sure a lot of people will wonder, well, why can't you just go back and get them now?
Yeah.
And, you know, because the Rangers took so long to even realize that they were missing, then the records had been destroyed by the carrier.
And what had happened is there was a crossover time when Singular Wireless was switching to AT&T Mobility, I believe it was, and so they got some AT&T records, but they didn't get the Singular records, or they got the Singular records and they didn't get the AT&T. I forget. The point is that the companies were being bought out, but there was at a time period where they were still two distinct companies with two different sets of records, and they only got one set of records. Then they didn't bother to look at them, and by the time they got around to looking at them and going, oh, these are incomplete, they go back and ask, well, this was when AT&T had it. Oh, okay, and then they call, or Singular, and then they call them and they say, well, yeah, we had them, but it's been more than 6 months or whatever, we don't have them anymore.
Right. So if Ranger Collins would have gotten them right then when
And
he
then
promised
looked- and
Brandon
looked at
and
them.
looked at them, right,
And
exactly.
looked at them, he would have realized we need to get them from AT&T and from Singular. But he just got one stack. I mean, he subpoenaed them and then just didn't bother to look at them or have anybody else go through them.
Right.
And by the time they figured it out, it was way too late. And so that was just another case of, well, that just means Brandon did it.
Now there's 14 hours missing on the magical day that Brandon's parents are killed, and it's the only day that 14 hours are missing. So every other day has, you know, they tried to say basically that they were AT&T records and they didn't get the records from AT&T, from the cell towers. However, there's other days that have reports from AT&T cell towers. There's other calls that come from AT&T cell towers. So what's so magical about this particular day that we don't get the AT&T records? So there's definitely a lot of suspicion around the phone records, and you know, maybe someday if they're able to bring any kind of new motion or something, they can look into that. They can have investigators look into it or whatever. But let's just suffice it to say for now, we don't know how accurate they were. So that's pretty much all we have. Does anybody have any comments on any of those? No? Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to sit down and listen to the facts of the Brandon Woodruff case. The film will be upcoming very soon, and hopefully you guys can all check that out. And then you guys can kind of see some of the background of what we've been talking about. There's a lot of things that we talked about that you're just going to have to wait, unfortunately, until the film comes out to see, or at least have it fully explained. But I hope that we touched on everything, and if you do have any questions, I'm sure there will be a comment area for you to leave comments, ask questions, and we'll see what we can do about answering your questions. Thank you guys very much for your time. We appreciate you spending spending your afternoon here with me, and hopefully we can, at the end of this, get an innocent person out of prison.